Vitamin D, when there's enough around in the body, it binds to something called a vitamin D receptor, and it fits just right. And when they're bound together, it can unlock a lot of things in the body. If a mother is deficient in vitamin D, this may have severe consequences in the developing fetal brain of her child, because maybe that gene that needs vitamin D to get activated is not getting activated. And as a consequence, there's not enough serotonin being made in that infant's brain. And so it possibly could affect the way that brain develops.
Autism, an increasing epidemic, 200 times increase from when I first started practicing. Are there simple preventive approaches other than vaccines? Hi, this is Dr. Mercola, helping you take control of your health. And today I am joined by a delightful biological scientist, Dr. Rhonda Patrick, who is just a pleasure to interact with. And she's published 2 papers that really expand on some very exciting, simple but powerful lifestyle interventions that could have profound influence not only on autism, but a variety of other developmental disorders in childhood. So welcome today, and thank you for joining us, Dr. Patrick.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Mercola.
So just fascinating work you've done, and we've heard it basically impacting simple things like vitamin D and nutrients in the diet. And we've heard about the influence of vitamin D and autism before, but only from a superficial level. But what you've done in your studies, you've really dug deep and have come up with just a brilliant hypothesis that it seems to have quite a significant validity to it. So I'm wondering if you could pave the way for us and help explain what you found.
Absolutely. So I think I usually, before I get into how vitamin D may be playing a role in autism, I like to kind of explain just briefly what vitamin D is.
Sure.
It's kind of important to understanding how it may play a role in brain function or brain dysfunction. And despite the name, vitamin D is actually, it actually gets converted into a steroid hormone. Mm-hmm. So, estrogen's a steroid hormone, testosterone's a steroid hormone, and vitamin D gets converted into a steroid hormone. And it actually regulates over 1,000 different physiological processes inside the body, which is a lot. It's actually controlling around 5% of the human genome. So that's a pretty significant amount.
I know you say those numbers, and I don't dispute them, but Dr. Hollick, who's really one of the leaders in vitamin D research, he thinks it's twice as many. And
Yes.
I specifically asked him that when I was with him last, because he had mentioned it was 5%, and he's convinced it's 10%. Any idea what the difference is in the opinion on that?
Yeah, so I think there is some emerging literature that is showing now there may be even twice as many different genes that contain a little telltale sequence in their DNA that vitamin D, when you have enough vitamin D in the body, it binds to something called a vitamin D receptor. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like when you have a key and you put it in a lock and it fits just right and you turn the lock and it opens the door. Mm-hmm. Well, vitamin D, when there's enough around in the body, it binds to something called a vitamin D receptor and it fits just right. And when they're bound together, it can unlock a lot of things in the body. And the way it does that is this vitamin D receptor complex can go deep inside the DNA, and it recognizes this little telltale sequence, like a little code. And the code itself can tell this vitamin D receptor complex to either turn a gene on so the gene is active, it's even more active, and it's doing a certain function, or it can tell it, hey, let's turn things down. I know you're here, but we don't need as much of you active. So it actually turns the gene down, and even though the gene is there, it's almost like it's not there because it's not as active. Mm-hmm. So, and the sequence itself, that little telltale sequence, can tell it on or off. And so with respect to Dr. Hollick and him thinking that maybe vitamin D is important for regulating maybe even 10% of the human genome, That's because there is now new emerging evidence that shows those little telltale sequences are even in twice as many genes. Okay. But it hasn't been empirically shown that indeed it does activate or not, or to turn it off. So I think I agree with Dr. Hollick that it's very likely that it may be controlling even more than what we know.
Yeah, which is, so it's a profound influence, there's no question. And we probably have only just begun to fully appreciate the tip of the iceberg of its influence, and eventually investigators like yourself uncover even more of the details and how it impacts our health. So thank you for expanding on that and answering my question, and I'll let you continue.
Yeah, and it's so relevant because so many people are not getting enough vitamin D. Mm-hmm. So I think it has huge relevance. You know, you mentioned that autism had been increasing about 200-fold.
It was 1 in 10,000 when I was in medical school. And now it's about, you know, the studies vary, but the minimum is 1 in 60, and I've seen estimates even from the CDC as low as 1 in 30. And the projections, here's what's even more frightening. The projections from reputable experts are suggesting that within 10, 20 years it's going to be half if the trend continues. 1 in 2 kids will have some type of autistic disorder, which is, I mean, how can a culture continue to thrive if half the kids whose brains aren't functioning? It can't. It's just a prescription for disaster.
Yeah, so it's been increasing by like 500% since the 1970s, and you know, yes, there is a very strong component of, you know, increased awareness. So more people are becoming aware of it, and so diagnoses are increasing. But that just can't account for the exponential increase in autism incidence. And I'm coming from this vitamin D angle, you know, so at the same time that autism incidence is going up, vitamin D deficiency has been going up, or you can look at it the other way, vitamin D sufficiency has been going down. Mm-hmm. So there's the correlation between autism incidence rising and vitamin D deficiency rising, largely as a consequence of people wearing sunscreen. You know, UVB radiation is very important to make vitamin D in the skin, and also staying indoors more, their computer screens, televisions. So you know, there's many different factors that are playing a role in that. But as I mentioned, you know, vitamin D has been shown to control at least 5% of the human genome, and it may even be much more than that. What I found, what my research identified when I was at Children's Hospital Oakland Research Institute with Dr. Bruce Ames, is that one of those genes that vitamin D is regulating is a gene that encodes for an enzyme called tryptophan hydroxylase, which is responsible for converting tryptophan, which you get from the protein that you eat, into serotonin. Mm-hmm. And most people associate serotonin with being a neurotransmitter in the brain that regulates your mood. It's important for feeling good. But actually it does so much more in the brain during brain development, and also throughout the rest of the body. So what was really interesting about my research and what I had identified is that first, there are 2 different tryptophan hydroxylase genes in the body. We have one in the brain and we have one in the gut. Mm-hmm. The one in the brain makes serotonin in the brain, and the one in the gut converts tryptophan into serotonin in the gut, and they're completely opposite. The serotonin in the gut does not cross over the blood-brain barrier and get into the brain. So
I'm sorry, let me apologize for stopping you, but that is such an important point. And it's a point I didn't really understand. I think most people watching this don't understand, because the reason this comes up is because it's typically taught that, the majority, 80% or more of the serotonin your body is produced in your gut. So then you're thinking it's going to improve brain function, but it doesn't, because it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. It's such a central point. So I just want to emphasize that.
Oh, totally. Actually, like 90% of the serotonin made in the body is in the gut. Yeah, and it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. It does serve a very important function. The serotonin made in the gut gets taken up by your platelets, and platelets can't make their own serotonin, so they need to get it from the serotonin that's made in the gut. And it plays a very important role in causing platelets to aggregate together, which is important when you injure yourself. If you cut yourself or you bruise yourself, you want to have that coagulation. You want to have those platelets aggregate together to form a clot so that you don't bleed out, have a hemorrhage and bleed out. So serotonin plays an important role in making sure that platelets do that. So you need to make serotonin in your gut. But on the other hand, it's a double-edged sword because too much serotonin in the gut actually causes gut inflammation. And the reason it does that is because it also activates immune cells in your gut called T cells and causes them to proliferate, and they can start firing away pro-inflammatory cytokines and things like that. And that's actually been shown in mouse models of colitis or inflammatory bowel disease. So you can genetically engineer mice to get colitis or inflammatory bowel disease, or you can give them environmental cues to cause, gut inflammation. And it's been shown if you stop those mice from producing serotonin in the gut, completely takes away their gut inflammation. It resolves very robustly. So too much inflammation in the gut is not good. And what I found is that the telltale sequence I was talking about that vitamin D recognizes in the gene that is important for making that enzyme that converts tryptophan into serotonin in the gut actually turns it off in the gut. So turns it down. It's like, okay, you don't need to make so much of this serotonin, so it kind of keeps it in check, so it's not like going crazy making too much serotonin. Whereas the tryptophan hydroxylase gene in the brain has a sequence that is completely opposite. It's actually consistent with activation. So vitamin D would then recognize the one in the brain and go, oh, turn on, make more serotonin in the brain. And serotonin in the brain plays a very important role in the way you feel. It plays an important role in impulse control, in long-term planning, long-term behavior, in anxiety, memory. So it plays an important role in a lot of different cognitive functions and behaviors. Actually, there's been a lot of very interesting studies that neuropsychologists, neurobehavioralists, and also neuroscientists have done in collaboration with each other, where normal people are given a big shake full of branched chain amino acids like leucine and isoleucine, which actually compete with tryptophan. Tryptophan is what I mentioned is you need tryptophan to make serotonin, but tryptophan has to get into your brain. It has to be transported into the brain. And the transporter that allows tryptophan to get into the brain also allows other amino acids like leucine and isoleucine to get into the brain. But those other branched chain amino acids get in better, and so they tend to outcompete tryptophan. So when there's a lot of branched chain amino acids around and not enough tryptophan, when the ratio is off, not a lot of tryptophan can get into the brain, which means you're not able to make as much serotonin in the brain. And this has, relevance for exercising, for example. When you're lifting weights, you actually cause branched chain amino acids to be taken up into your muscle cells to build muscle. And so that alleviates the competition and allows tryptophan to get into the brain, and is part of the reason why, in addition to endorphins and many other things, why exercise makes you feel so good, because you're now allowing tryptophan to get into the brain so you can make more serotonin. So anyways, I digress.
It's interesting. There's an interesting other component of that too that I just recognized or appreciated recently, is that when you are on a ketogenic diet, using primarily burning fats as fuel, those ketones are very similar in structure to the branched chain amino acids. And the body seems to preferentially metabolize the ketones than the branched chain amino acids. So those actually increase, even though your intake didn't increase at all, because they're not degrading them and using them as fuel. So, I think I didn't understand the connection between the competitive inhibition into the passing the blood-brain barrier. So, I guess that's a potential complication. Is that you're actually going to decrease brain levels of serotonin by increasing the branched chain amino acids.
Yes. If you don't let the branched chain amino acids go to other places like the muscle, where they actually serve a really important role in increasing muscle mass. But you can actually deplete people of their brain serotonin by giving them a big shake of amino acids that are essentially branched chain amino acids without tryptophan. So you take away the tryptophan and you just give them a bunch of leucine and isoleucine. And because it outcompetes tryptophan, within a few hours, about 90% of the brain serotonin levels drop.
Wow.
Right.
Do you consistently see?
This gives scientists a opportunity to study the behavioral effects, the causal behavioral effects of lowering brain serotonin in people.
And that's a standard intervention to produce serotonin deficiency?
Yes. This is a
Wow.
standard intervention in research to induce brain serotonin deficiency in people, normal people, people with autism, people with ADHD. It's been done in a variety of different disease states, as well as just people that have not been diagnosed with any sort of brain dysfunctional disorder. And what's pretty ubiquitous is that what happens is people become very impulsive. So they're more likely to just kind of make a decision without thinking about it, without thinking of the long-term benefits, kind of weighing the cost, to the risks, the benefits to the risk ratio. And so their long-term thinking, their long-term planning kind of shuts down a little bit, and they kind of just go for that impulse. Mood is affected. People become a little more depressed. They become anxious, and memory is affected. Sensory gating, which is the ability to filter out all this stimuli our brains are getting, auditory, visual, these things are coming in, and our brains can focus in on one thing, a conversation that we're having, for example, but that is affected when serotonin's low. Everything comes in and you sort of get this overload, where you just don't know what to do. So lots of different brain functions are affected by lowering brain serotonin levels. And
depression being a primary one. I mean, that one most common antidepressants is SSRIs, or serotonin uptake inhibitors.
Exactly.
And it's a question of whether or not they really work that way, because of this whole placebo effect. But anyway, that's at least the speculative mechanism.
Yeah, it's the way they work is sort of understood, but there's so many different feedback effects and effects that aren't understood, that we don't really know exactly what's going on with SSRIs. And they also, there's a lot of negative feedback effects as well. So that's a whole other topic. But yeah, depression is one of the major ones that's known to be regulated by serotonin. And so I digressed a little bit, but I just wanted people to
understand it's important, right?
How important serotonin is
Right.
in just normal brain function. So again, vitamin D, what I found is that vitamin D is activating that gene that makes serotonin in the brain, and it's kind of turning down the one in the gut, so you're not making as much serotonin in the gut. And since I published my first paper on this back in 2014, an independent group at the University of Arizona biochemically validated, indeed, vitamin D does activate that gene, tryptophan hydroxylase 2, to make a lot more of it in a variety of different neuronal cell types, which was really nice validation of my work from an independent group, showing that indeed vitamin D does activate that gene in the brain to make serotonin.
Yeah, and just to emphasize something, this was not known prior to you finding this out and publishing it. This is a new finding, so just major kudos and congratulations for that discovery, because it really is a significant advance in the understanding of this disease.
I appreciate that. Yeah, and it was not known, and I did a lot of research that was theoretical in the sense that I wasn't doing any experimental work. It was actually my first theoretical publication. Up until then, I had been doing experiments, publishing on things that I had been testing experimentally. So this was the first time that I had just taken all this data that's out in the literature and sort of put pieces together and like a puzzle, and things just started to fit together. And maybe some of it's not going to be, maybe I was wrong on some things. We'll
Sure. Well,
other scientists will
that is
find
really
out,
that is one of your great characteristics and traits. There's no question about it. It's so clear to me that there's so few scientists who can look at the data, connect the dots, and make some really good predictions. And it's the rare person or researcher that can do this, and you can do it on steroids. I mean, it's just amazing how gifted you are doing this. So I'm just so excited to have a collaboration with you, because you really, and you share this healthy viewpoint on life, where you're applying most of these interventions yourself, and really trying to push the limits and things. And you're it's just a great combination of gifts to have, and really help us understand what's going on and find the truth.
You're very complimentary. Thank you. And thanks for giving me a microphone to get the word out. I'm also very appreciative of it.
All right, so
back to autism, right?
Yes.
Should we get back to autism?
Sure.
Okay. The other thing that serotonin is doing in the brain during early brain development, fetal brain development, is it actually, so when you have a developing fetus, the brain's developing, it actually acts as what's called a brain morphogen. And what that means is serotonin is required in a developing fetal brain in order to shape the structure and the wiring of the brain. And it does this by telling neurons where to go in the brain and what type of neurons to become. And if you don't have serotonin there doing that, this leads to abnormal brain structure, abnormal brain wiring, and in mouse models, it's been shown to lead to sort of the mouse equivalent of autistic behaviors. So serotonin is playing a very important role in brain development. And what's really interesting is that the developing fetus depends entirely on the mother's levels of vitamin D. So the maternal levels of vitamin D cross over, the placenta, cross over the blood-brain barrier, get into the fetal brain, and are activating all those genes. So you can imagine that if a mother is deficient in vitamin D, this may have severe consequences in the developing fetal brain of her child, because maybe that gene that needs vitamin D to get activated is not getting activated. And as a consequence, there's not enough serotonin being made in that infant's brain. And so it possibly could affect the way that brain develops. And this is the sort of connection I made between, as you mentioned, Dr. Mercola, earlier, vitamin D has been linked to autism by many different researchers, and low serotonin has been linked to autism by many different researchers. But no one sort of put the two together as a mechanism going, oh, look, maybe the low vitamin D leads to the low serotonin in the developing brain. And this may be part of the reason why there's an increase in autism. It may be part of the way that low vitamin D leads to autism. And I think there's a very complex interaction between that and also genes. Variations in genes are called gene polymorphisms. Mm-hmm. And really all you need to know about that is people have different variations of genes that lead to the different functions. And many genes involved in serotonin production and serotonin function also can be disrupted, and those have been shown to lead to autism. So if you have someone that's already susceptible genetically to low serotonin, and on top of that, you have vitamin D deficiency, it's like a double whammy, mm-hmm. So I think that's something that I'd like people to recognize, that there's this interesting interaction between our genes also and the nutrient input, the way different nutrients are interacting with the way we're making serotonin. So that's kind of one end of, I talk about many different things in this paper in terms of autism incidence, and I think that's one of the most compelling arguments. And there's also another one that has to do with the gut, if you want to talk about
Sure,
that.
let's go into that. Yeah.
Okay. So the other way is, maternal autoimmunity has been linked to autism. Are you aware of this? Of the maternal?
No, I wasn't.
So mothers of autistic children are 4 times more likely to have autoantibodies against fetal brain proteins in their blood at any time. So, you shouldn't have in your blood antibodies against brain proteins. Mm-hmm. That's not normal. But mothers of autistic children are 4 times more likely to have this. In addition to that, some studies that have been done at UC Davis have shown experimentally when you cause pregnant monkeys to have like a very strong autoimmune response during pregnancy, this leads to abnormal brain development. So having an autoimmune response is not a good thing for anyone, and it's particularly not a good thing for a pregnant mother. And for people that don't really understand what that means, so an autoimmune response means your immune system is so activated that it starts to recognize its own organs, its own tissue as something foreign, like a bacteria or a virus, when no, it's not foreign, this is your own organ, this is your own tissue. But your immune cells, for a variety of different reasons, can't recognize that, and so they start attacking it and damaging the tissue. And in the case of pregnancy, you have a fetus. There's an embryo that starts growing into this little developing fetus. Well, your body can recognize that as foreign. It's like, whoa, what's this? This isn't supposed to be here. Attack, get rid of it. And that can lead to a very severe autoimmune response. But our bodies are wonderfully designed, and we have a protective mechanism against that happening. So we can make a type of immune cell called T regulatory cells. T regulatory cells are very important because the more of them you have, these tell your body, no, wait a minute, this is my body, this is supposed to be here, quiet down, immune system, don't go crazy. So really, the T regulatory cells are a type of immune cell that play a very important role in keeping your immune system in check, making sure your immune system knows what's really foreign and what's your own self. So T regulatory cells are very important. Well, I mentioned earlier that there's another enzyme that we have in our gut that converts tryptophan into serotonin. And this is separate from the brain one. Well, it turns out females also have the same enzyme in the gut in the placenta. So in the placenta, you can convert tryptophan into serotonin. And you want to do this to some degree. But tryptophan also gets metabolized by another pathway into something called kynurenine, which then forms the regulatory cells, those important immune cells I just mentioned, that are important for keeping your immune system, in check so that it doesn't go crazy. And if you don't let tryptophan form the kynurenine, your T regulatory cells plummet. And this has been shown in animal models, in mice, for example. You take a mouse and you delete that enzyme genetically that produces kynurenine, that allows tryptophan to be converted into kynurenine and then into the T regulatory cells. Pregnant female mice have such a strong autoimmune response that they actually end up aborting the fetus because the immune system just attacks it, and it dies. So you want to make sure that tryptophan, not all of the tryptophan is being converted into serotonin in the placenta. You also want it to be converted through this other pathway into T regulatory cells. Well, it turns out that tryptophan actually binds 3 times tighter to the enzyme tryptophan hydroxylase, which converts tryptophan into serotonin. So, back to the vitamin D. If you don't have enough vitamin D around, if you're vitamin D deficient, you may be making way more of this enzyme that binds tryptophan, and it may act as like a sink, a trap, where tryptophan's being sucked into that pathway and producing serotonin in the placenta, and the tryptophan doesn't have a chance to then be converted through that other pathway to form kynurenine and T regulatory cells. And this may have a negative effect, particularly during pregnancy, because you're not making enough T regulatory cells, and therefore you start to have a heightened autoimmune response. So, vitamin D has been connected to autoimmunity through a variety of different mechanisms. I think this is one potential additional mechanism that vitamin D may be regulating autoimmunity, because it may quiet down that other enzyme that binds to the tryptophan so tightly and may be acting as a trap for that tryptophan. It just keeps getting sucked into it like a vacuum. Instead, vitamin D turns that down a little bit, quiets it. So now the tryptophan can be more balanced out. It can go this way into forming serotonin in the gut and in the placenta, and it can be going the other way to form the kynurenine and the T regulatory cells.
Do you think this would play a role in other autoimmune diseases also? Because
I do.
There's no question in my clinical experience that it's reprehensible clinical malpractice if you don't optimize vitamin D levels in someone with an autoimmune disease. That is the first step you've got to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it plays a huge role. I mean, we know that vitamin D, undoubtedly, there is irrefutable evidence that it plays a huge role in preventing multiple sclerosis. That's you just can't deny that data. It's just genetically from every angle, vitamin D levels, every angle you look at it, it comes out that vitamin D plays an important role.
Which is the classic autoimmune disease.
The classic autoimmune disease, exactly. So I think that vitamin D, this is a potential other, and I know I went in a little bit into the weeds on this one.
No, it's important to do it because not many people are discussing this, so I appreciate your insights.
Yeah, it's not being discussed, but I think it's important not only during pregnancy, but I think it's important just, during development, during adult life, it's important. It's a general mechanism that potentially is one other way vitamin D is regulating autoimmunity.
Yeah.
and preventing autoimmune responses by making sure you have enough of those Tregs, T
Yeah.
regulatory cells.
I hadn't heard of that before, so I appreciate the insights. And I just wanted to confirm that it was true for other autoimmune diseases, and it apparently is.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, there's going to be more and more experimental work definitively showing that. But I think it's one other potential way. I mean, you can expand it, to other autoimmune diseases. It's not just, during pregnancy. But I think that this, you mentioned it's almost malpractice for a physician not to optimize someone's vitamin D levels, particularly if they have an autoimmune disease. Well, I think that there's a simple solution for OBGYN practitioners, normal just family practitioners, for any female that wants to get pregnant or is pregnant. I think there's a simple solution, and that is, one, get your vitamin D levels measured, and two, supplement, make sure you're getting enough vitamin D, high enough to make sure that you have optimal levels of vitamin D so you're not deficient. I think that's a simple solution to possibly preventing diseases like autism, and this is relevant for other diseases as well, ADHD, schizophrenia, variety of different brain dysfunctions. As I mentioned, serotonin plays an important role in a variety of behaviors. So I think it can be generalized to a lot of different, just normal brain functioning.
Yeah, and just to highlight and remind people what those levels are, because I've sort of transitioned back and forth on that, but after reviewing this for nearly 2 decades, I'm fairly convinced of the data that the range is probably between 40 and 60 nanograms per ml.
We're in agreement.
Yeah, you don't want to be under 40, that is for sure. And the sweet spot might be at 50. Bruce Hollis did some really interesting work in pregnant women, actually, and found out that vitamin D sufficiency was right around that level. So, and 60 gives you a little threshold to go down. Because if you're relying on the sunlight exposure, obviously you're not going to have access to sunlight continuously, so that you have a reserve that you can fluctuate down below that. So,
yeah, just to add on to that, I think the sweet spot for vitamin D is very important. Oftentimes, when people find out something's good for them, they have a tendency to just go overboard.
The Goldilocks syndrome.
Right. What's it called?
Goldilocks syndrome.
Goldilocks syndrome. Right. Yeah. So, it's very important, because too much vitamin D can be toxic. So I think there is a sweet spot, and
well, it has a very low level of toxicity. You really have to overdose in the millions of units.
Yeah, I don't mean toxic in the acute sense.
But less than optimal. It's not going. You're not going to hit that sweet spot. There's no reason to go crazy with this.
Right. Yeah, I think that between 40 and 60 is a really good window, because studies have shown that people within that range, meta-analyses have shown, between 1960s to 2012 or something, just lots and lots of studies aggregated together have shown that people with blood levels of vitamin D within that range have the lowest all-cause mortality, meaning they die less of all non-accidental deaths like cancer, neurodegenerative disease, cardiovascular-related diseases, respiratory diseases. So there is something to be said for that. And also, people genetically that have low vitamin D levels are susceptible to higher all-cause mortality. So that's also something to consider. And vitamin D does play a very important role in the aging process. I don't know if you've seen any of these studies, Dr. Mercola, with mice.
Telomere line?
Telomere is probably the mechanism, but there's another study that was published. I love this study. It was published back in it was like 2009. I'll send it to you, where researchers genetically engineered mice to not be able to respond to vitamin D. They altered the vitamin D receptor. So essentially, these mice, it's like being vitamin D deficient, because their cells can't respond to vitamin D. So it's like there's no vitamin D there. And these mice have a progeria phenotype. That is, they have an accelerated aging phenotype. If you look at these same mice if you look at control mice that have normal levels of vitamin D throughout their life, and you compare it to these mice that are genetically been designed to be vitamin D deficient, but at about 4 months of age, they look the same. They look similar. But then you look at them again at around 8 months of age, and the vitamin D deficient mouse lost all of its hair, its skin is really wrinkled, its organs are starting to age like rapidly. I mean, its kidneys are shutting down, the liver's not working. I mean, it's just, it just looks awful. So vitamin D is playing a very important role in the aging process. And as you mentioned, it does play an important role in telomere length.
Yes.
And I'm sure you've talked about telomere.
Well, and just to reinforce too, the ideal way, the way that we were designed to get vitamin D is from being outside in adequate sunshine, having enough skin exposed. Clearly,
Yes.
in the winter, the majority of the population in the U.S., this is not going to happen. It just isn't. But that's one of the reasons why I moved to Florida, so I can get it naturally. I haven't swallowed oral vitamin D in a long time, like years, like many, many years, and my
Wow.
level's still within that sweet spot. But the question I have for you is really about these polymorphisms, because clinically, so if you can't get it from the sun exposure, you're going to have to swallow a pill. But there's a significant portion of the population who, even when they were given 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 units a day, still don't get to levels within that. And is that because of these polymorphisms that essentially don't allow the liver to hydroxylate the vitamin D, because that's what we measure in the blood, the 25-hydroxy-D?
You nailed it. Yes, that's exactly why. So there is a very common gene polymorphism in a gene that it codes for an enzyme called CYP2R1,
Okay.
which converts vitamin D3 into 25-hydroxy vitamin D, which is the major circulating form of vitamin D. It's what most people, most physicians measure as a marker of a vitamin D status. And this polymorphism in the gene, which basically just alters the sequence in the gene, which alters the function of it, what it does is it alters it in a way that enzyme doesn't work as well. And so vitamin D3 is not getting converted into 25-hydroxy vitamin D very well. And as a consequence, people with this gene polymorphism, in some cases, have to take very, very high doses of vitamin D3 orally to achieve normal levels of 25-hydroxy vitamin D. And levels that people like you and I would never take, because it could be, it could induce some negative effects. But you wouldn't know that if you never got your vitamin D levels measured. So, I actually know 3 people in my close, friend network that have this gene polymorphism, and they have to take very, very high levels of vitamin D.
Physicians see this all the time. If they're monitoring patients, there are loads of people in their population. I don't know what the incidence is, but I suspect it's over 5%. It's not a small percentage of people who have this.
I agree with you. I don't know what the incidence either. That's something I'm trying to look into to see how prevalent it is, because that's sort of important to know. It's definitely, in order for anything to be considered a gene polymorphism, it has to be over 1% of the population.
Okay, I didn't know that was a definition. Okay.
Yeah. So the difference between a mutation and a gene polymorphism, for people listening, a mutation is thought to occur randomly. A mutation happens in your gene, and it happens randomly, for whatever reason. Your mitochondrial metabolism isn't working properly. It's dumping out all sorts of toxic things that may possibly, cause a mutation. And that happens randomly in the population. Well, a gene polymorphism is thought to have arisen because of a certain reason, like it's been selected for. And the reason this is thought is because it occurs in at least 1% of the population, and in some cases up to 50% of the population. So, there's all these variations in different genes that are so common that it's like, well, there has to be a reason. And it's largely thought, at least in the scientific community, that these gene polymorphisms occur based on, nutrition, based on our environment, where we lived. So we used to be hunter-gatherers. We lived in isolated regions. For example, we could have lived in a part of the world where the selenium in the soil was very, very high. And so as a population, we, could have, gotten a gene polymorphism in a gene that lowers our selenium absorption, because we don't need as much. We're getting it all the time. So our body's like, as a response, well, I don't need as much selenium, or I'm going to get too much of it. So it changes the sequence of DNA in such a way that the gene that controls that now isn't doing it as much. And there's many examples of this. So
let me give you a really good illustration of this. It's a personal one. As I have a gene polymorphism for one of the hemoglobin genes, and it's called thalassemia, Mediterranean anemia, which is similar to sickle cell. It produces a hemoglobin variant, that makes the red blood cells really tiny and produce an excess of them. It's relative polycythemia. So the benefit, the reason why this persists in the population is that what is one of the most common causes of death in the world ever? Malaria. More people have died from malaria, I think, than any other cause. And this polymorphism provides a relative protection to the acquiring that infection or dying from it, which is interesting. So that's why it persists.
Exactly. Great example, Dr. Mercola. I love it. And it reminds me of another very, very common gene polymorphism called ApoE. So there's different forms of ApoE, ApoE1, 2, 3, and 4. I'm sure you're familiar with this, but ApoE4 is in 25% of the population, very, very common, but it has all these negative effects. It increases cardiovascular related diseases and has a much higher incidence of Alzheimer's. But what's really interesting, I found in the literature, is that people with this ApoE4 allele, or having this polymorphism, are protected from malaria. So, again, that's a pretty important function.
Yeah, when it's such a common cause of death, if you want the population to persist in the environment, you're going to have some relative protection against these common causes of death.
Yeah, and exactly. And if you think about, in the case of ApoE4, you're talking about Alzheimer's disease or cardiovascular disease. Well, these are age-related diseases. These are things that occur much later in life. And your body doesn't really care. Your body cares about surviving right now, being able to live so you can reproduce, pass on your genes. Well, malaria will take you out when you're any age, so that's something that's obviously very important to protect against. So you can imagine that it's going to stay within the population.
All right, so we've gone a little tangent. I think it was important to illustrate some of these points, though. But getting back to the vitamin D and then going back to the original hypothesis, assuming with these gene polymorphisms that limit that percentage of the population, we don't know what, but it's clearly over 1%, probably under 10%, where the people that need a lot of extra vitamin D, I would imagine those same individuals, if they were to get their primary exposure through the sunlight, healthy doses of sunlight, that they could generate, most people don't realize and appreciate how much vitamin D you get if you expose your skin to sunlight. You can easily get 10, 20, 30,000 units with a relatively small amount of time exposure if you're healthy and you've got your biological systems up. So my guess is that these individuals wouldn't even necessarily notice it because they're sort of overdosing and then through the feedback loops regulating it so that it's normal anyway, and it sort of bypasses that polymorphism. Would that be a fair assumption, or?
I'm not sure, because you're making vitamin D in your skin, your body, it's very tightly regulated, and so when you get to a certain level, there's all these mechanisms that degrade precursors for D3 into something else so that it doesn't become D3, just because your body doesn't, because it's a fat-soluble vitamin. If you're out in the sun, which we were when we were hunter-gatherers, we were out there all the time, vitamin D toxicity never really occurs from the sun because of that tight regulation where your body can sense what the levels are and go, okay, I've got enough. I don't need to keep making more of this. And so I don't really know.
But wouldn't that feedback be altered if there was a polymorphism that influenced the hydroxylation?
One would think. One would think it would. Yeah, one would think it would, so that you would probably keep making.
The bottom line is the body just self-regulates. It's just a beautiful system, and the more we come to understand how it does it, the simpler our recommendations are, and the more effective they become.
Yes, I agree. The body is beautifully designed. It knows best. It's able to understand things that we're just scratching the surface, beginning to scratch the surface on understanding. And in the case of getting it from the sun, there's obviously like many women, that are have melanin, for example, which protects them from the burning rays of the sun, but also prevents their bodies from making vitamin D3 as efficiently. Living in places like Chicago, living in more northern latitudes where 6 months out of the year, the UVB rays aren't even actually hitting the atmosphere. So I think that one has to consider many factors, like in terms of whether or not they're going to supplement, in terms of whether or not they can even make it from the sun, depending on where they live, depending on how dark their skin color is, depending on their health status, depending on how if they're obese or overweight. There's many different things, what their age is. So I do think getting a blood test, if you are out there making vitamin D from the sun, then get a blood test just to make sure that
Sure.
you're within that sweet spot range.
Yeah, you definitely.
They're pretty easy to ask your physician to do. You can even order them online. I think there's a variety of tests that are available.
Sure. So thank you so much for your work and your investigations and providing such an articulate and elegant description of what's likely occurring. It actually has been proven scientifically since your original paper. So let's put it all together, because you're so good at tying the dots. The message that we want to share with it is an important one, that we can literally, that an ounce of prevention is worth tons of a cure. And many times you can't even get a cure because it's just not possible, because you have irreversible damage. So the key message here is, before you even think about getting pregnant ideally, but certainly if you are, or if you know anyone who is, they've got to get their vitamin D tested. It's just has to be done. There's no way around it.
Prevention, is key, like you mentioned. I think making sure you have that vitamin D is very, very important for making sure that the developing brain is getting enough of it, since it's relying on its mother's levels of vitamin D to activate the serotonin in the brain, developing brain.
Okay. Well, it's been known for a while, as we said at the beginning, that vitamin D is useful to lower the incidence of this, but we didn't know why until you uncovered it. So thank you so much for that really brilliant research and for helping us understand the details, because the devil is in the details. And if you can understand the mechanism, then you can begin to better appreciate and have a finer recommendation and revision of what the strategy is to prevent these diseases. So,
absolutely. Well, thanks again, Dr. Mercola, for having me on your show and letting me discuss some of my recent research.
Well, we definitely look forward to it. And you have your own show at foundmyfitness.com. It is one that I review regularly because you interview some of the top scientists in the world. I mean, you really are a very gifted researcher in that and your brain works so well that you can connect all these dots together, because most people can't connect the dots. They're just experts in their little specific field, and they just can't think out of the box to how to connect to anything else. And someone has to do that. It really is the job of in medicine, it's the job of the family physician, to really sort of have this comprehensive view and then help people apply that knowledge from all these different subspecialists. So you do that in the biological science field, and appreciate that. And your interviews are a joy to watch, and it's free to subscribe. Foundmyfitness.com. So we have put some, and we'll be putting more of your interviews up as you do them. So thank you for that.
Yeah. So in addition to doing interviews, I also have a health newsletter where I write articles, and I also make videos where I sort of put together, connect the dots, and try to transfer this information to people so they can understand the best of their ability, the best lifestyle strategy to help them age the best way they can.
Yeah, when you do that's sort of what I was seeking to communicate when I mentioned it earlier. You do the interviews, but you have these other the videos that you produce. And the beautiful thing about your videos, as you can tell, but if you've watched this video up until now, is that you're able to translate very complex technical issues into simple language that people can understand. That is a rare gift. I think I do that somewhat well on my site for medical things, but you do it really well for the biological sciences. So that's why I'm so really fond of your work. So definitely, if you have the time, I would strongly recommend and encourage you to subscribe to your newsletter, because they're just a joy to watch.
Thank you, Dr. Mercola.
All right. Well, we'll definitely continue to highlight some of the research and the work that you're uncovering. So thanks for all